Even though the House of Commons has risen for the summer, Canada's Conservatives have forced Justin Trudeau's Liberals to have emergency meetings of the Citizenship and Immigration Committee in order to hold Justin Trudeau to account for his #Welcome to Canada tweet and the fact that since he tweeted that, 31,000 people have crossed from the United States into Canada illegally and subsequently claimed asylum. Now, we've heard from mayors in some of Canada's biggest cities that homeless shelters are at capacity because of this issue. We've watched Justin Trudeau's Liberals spend hundreds of millions of dollars outside of the budgetary process to sort of take a Band-Aid solution to this problem. And then most recently, we've watched federal-provincial talks completely disintegrate because the federal government really doesn't have a plan to address this issue. You know, one of the principles that Parliament in Canada operates on is that parliamentarians should have the right to scrutinize taxpayer expenditures. In this instance, the government under Justin Trudeau, every 2 weeks or so, is coming out making announcements with hundreds of millions of dollars that are outside of the budgetary process to deal with this, and I say deal with this in quotations, crisis of their own making, where we've seen tens of thousands of people enter Canada illegally from the United States of America and then subsequently claim asylum. On August the 9th in Toronto, there are several hundred people who are being housed in university and college dormitories who are facing eviction because Canadian students are about to enter the university session, and the government has no plan to deal with this. This is why we force these emergency meetings, because frankly, I don't think that it's right. The government should be making hundreds of millions of dollars worth of announcements without any sort of plan. I want you to watch my press conference that I gave today here in Ottawa, talking about why we need these meetings, and you'll find some of the questions that I got from the mainstream media very interesting. I hope you watch some of my responses, but I also want you to watch my rationale that I lay out to people at the Immigration Committee. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. The government has made, under Justin Trudeau, a significant policy departure in terms of who enters Canada when. And by effectively rendering the Safe Third Country Agreement moot, by making the Roxham Road crossing a permanent but not permanent crossing so that people can continue to exploit the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, you know, the government really needs to now account for the hundreds of millions of dollars it's going to cost to house people, to educate people, to pay for welfare payments, to process their claims, to expedite their work permits, to integrate them into the Canadian economy, given that now this seems to be a very permanent process. Watch my press conference and watch my intervention at committee and let me know what you think in the comments.
Good afternoon. I'm encouraged that we will be having further meetings this summer to look at the issue of the border crossing crisis at Roxham Road and the impacts that it's having on provincial social programs, as well as the fact that the Liberal government does not have a plan on this issue. What I was very discouraged about, however, was to hear some of the rhetoric that came out of Liberal members' mouths. The word hysterical, the assertion that the government has a plan, I think just belies the fact that the federal government is not taking this seriously. I was also disappointed that the government side did not agree to have more robust time meetings with each of the ministers that they've brought. I think if we do have a meeting where 3 federal ministers spend an hour in the room, that's kind of a mockery of the process. So I'll look very eagerly to the chair of the committee to ensure that opposition members have time to ask questions. I also intend to invite some of our provincial counterparts to testify at these meetings, and I certainly hope that the government side and the government chair of the committee will allow provincial counterparts to testify. Once again, I think the fact that during this meeting the federal government gave a very vague and vaguely worded statement about helping Toronto or being committed to helping the Toronto homeless crisis issue without any sort of details or budget really underscores the need for emergency meetings in the summer, because we don't understand, now that the government has made the decision to normalize the illegal border crossing issue at Roxham Road, what their long-term plan is to pay for this. So certainly the Conservative Party, my colleagues here are very, I'm very proud that we were able to force this, to hold the government to account, and I would hope that the government does more than just pay lip service or use very divisive language as a mean to detract from the necessity to come up with a fully costed plan this summer. Thank you.
Who from the Ontario government do you intend to invite?
Minister Lisa MacLeod has already indicated her desire to appear before this committee, and I will be extending that invitation to her.
And anyone else from other provinces?
Certainly, I would invite at this point in time other provincial counterparts to send a note to me if they would like to be included on this list. I know that Minister Jeremy Harrison from Saskatchewan had expressed his displeasure with the meeting that happened in Winnipeg on Friday. I know that the Quebec government has had to make some pretty significant policy decisions in recent weeks. I think on Friday it was announced that they had decided to suspend daycare provision to the children of asylum seekers or asylum seeker children. So I think that I would hope that provincial counterparts who want to talk about the impact in a very productive way would write to my office and let me know that they want to attend. And I would also ask that they make that request public, as the government does hold the majority on the committee and the chair of the committee, and I wouldn't want any provincial requests to be conveniently forgotten.
What's the most burning question you want to ask Minister Hussein?
Oh my God, there's so many, right? To me, I tried to lay out in a very comprehensive way all of the different categories of data that are lacking for parliamentarians to scrutinize the adequacy of the government's response to this issue and even what their policy position is. I think we need to start from the very top and say, has this now become normal? Is this permanent? Is the government now permanently going to allow Roxham Road to continue? Is the amendment of the Safe Third Country Agreement completely off the table? And then from there, especially if they don't have a response on that, we have to start drilling down into what this means, both in terms of, or in terms of the impact on integration and resettlement services, the prioritization of, and the capacity for Canada to resettle other groups from around the world, as I outlined in my speech. The capacity of provincial governments to provide social programs, the demographic background of the cohorts that are entering via Roxham Road, how the government plans to integrate people into the Canadian economy over time, how many people they're projecting over the next 5 years, what the total estimated cost of removals will be over the next 10 years, whether or not the government intends, because of the permanency of the situation at Roxham Road, how much they intend to allocate to the Immigration Refugee Board to expand that bureaucracy for people who most likely won't have valid asylum claims, and whether by doing so they have in fact made an assertion that the United States is no longer a safe third country. And I think that is a fair question to ask, because by normalizing this situation, to me that's what they've decided to do. They've decided to suspend this agreement. And I also want to ask him about the opportunity cost, whether or not and why he thinks that this is a better expenditure of resources than spending this money on prioritizing applications for people who are trying to have spouses come to Canada, or privately sponsored refugees that may be waiting for 7 years to come to Canada, or if it's a better expenditure of revenues for provincial governments to be allocating and trying to figure out expenditures on, as we heard today, on hotels and homeless shelters for people who are crossing at Roxham Road, versus immediately prioritizing the needs of Canadians who are low-income Canadians that are already struggling in these provinces, and how they plan to reconcile those two things. Those are the questions on really where the rubber is hitting the road on this issue, and the government has really shied away from that. So I hope that we have a robust opportunity to be able to question the governments on these issues, and I hope that the provincial governments will also come forward with some very honest and realistic assessments of what the impact of this dramatic change in policy has been on provincial budgets.
How do you explain the difference in tone towards the federal government between the Ontario government and the Quebec government?
Well,
It's escalated really quickly.
Sure. I mean, when I look at, and I will allow Pierre to come in and talk about Quebec. I mean, Quebec did call the federal government's response disastrous earlier this year, right? That was the exact word that they used, a complete disaster, I believe. And they were the ones who were putting out the figure of 400 per day, and there was actually a lot of pressure on the federal government from Quebec to respond, and the government did almost immediately with over $150 million. So I don't really see a difference in tone, it's just a difference in tone in the timing, right? I also think that the Quebec government put out a request to have people who were entering Roxham Road bused to other parts of the country, and now that those people are being bused to other parts of the country, governments are going, well, hey, wait a second, what about us? And so I think that this is sort of like a ripple effect that is going across the country right now, and governments are speaking out as it's impacting them. The government of Ontario, we have a new government that is looking at, who has a mandate from the people of Ontario to, I think, bring Ontario into a more fiscally responsible position than the last government. And I think it's very reasonable for them to ask, well, especially given they've got the mayors of two major cities saying we're out of space in our homeless shelters, ask the federal government how they plan to pay for additional spaces. So, you know, I want to step back and say I don't see this as a partisan issue. I think we have political stripes of different governments at provincial levels across the country, but I think everyone is asking the same question, and that is, how do we sustain this over time? And that is a core question related to the immigration file writ large. Our levels should be matched on the humanitarian side with our ability across governments, be it federal, municipal, provincial, to provide integration support. We need to budget for that. And then on the economic side, making sure that when people are entering the country, that they're matched to regions with specific labor needs. And we haven't seen that happen. And so I would like to see, you know, it's not so much about me labeling tone as it is forcing the government to sit down and give a venue for provinces to talk about their needs in what has been a dramatically and vastly changed environment for immigration policy in Canada over the last 18 months.
How do you feel about the other ministers attending? Is that less time with Hussein in your view?
Well, absolutely. I'll be very frank. I think that they've put Mr. Good, depending on the cabinet shuffle on Wednesday, of course. You never know who we're going to get. I do think that and I've seen the government put other ministers up with Minister Hussein because his performances have been quite weak in committee. I think that you know, he hasn't been able to answer questions adequately, and you've seen him, especially in Winnipeg, his communication to the provinces was pretty abysmal. So my assumption is the motivation for that is to make sure that the Minister of Immigration, the current Minister of Immigration, again, we don't know after Wednesday, has the support, the communication support, so it doesn't descend into the debacle that we saw in Winnipeg. I'm encouraged that Minister Goodale will be there because I think that there's a lot of questions related to resourcing in the CBSA. We've had a very difficult time as a joint committee. My colleague Pierre has done a wonderful job on public safety, trying to get answers to some of the screening questions as well as removal orders. We haven't received that information from him, so that's a positive thing. But I do hope that we have a longer period of time. And I did make that point in committee as well, as by stacking 3 ministers, you do compact the amount of time that opposition gets to have questions, and I think it's completely unreasonable to expect 7 minutes with 3 ministers that's no more than lip service to a study like this.
The minister just tweeted that he's ready to appear at committee, can't wait to appear at committee, impatient to express his clear plan and also to combat disinformation. What's your reaction to that?
So I did respond to, the minister issued a series of tweets yesterday, I believe, and there was a few things that he's quoting, saying is disinformation. The first is that there has been no impact on other lines of processing in citizenship and immigration, which I completely disagree with. The reality is that the government is expending hundreds of millions of dollars and redirecting staff resources to deal with the Roxham Road issue, and that is there's an opportunity cost to doing that. So instead of allocating those resources to spousal sponsorship, family reunification, he is making a choice to prioritize people who are legally crossing the border at Roxham Road. So that is false. The other component that he's put forward is that somehow it's an accomplishment that the government, having 1,200 people illegally enter the country in June of this year, even though it is higher year over year than 2017, it is somehow an accomplishment, or that somehow that this is the situation has resolved itself. Think about that for a minute. 1,200 people illegally crossing the border with no plan on how to house them after Toronto and Ottawa have said that there is a homeless crisis, is a shelter crisis, is a problem. He's also said that you know, he's started to use the language that the Prime Minister's guy, Gerald Butts, was using with, you know, when he called Lisa MacLeod alt-right. You know, I think this is kind of rich, given that the minister himself, as we quoted in committee, has frequently used the term illegal and has defined it, or has defended doing so. And frankly, I don't think any of you standing here would be able to make a strong business case that the government has put forward a fully costed plan with regard that assumes, that tells us the number of people that they expect to come in via this method, how they plan to integrate these people into the Canadian economy over time, how they plan to fix the issue with the IRB, and how they plan to pay for the eventual removal orders associated with this mass influx of people from the United States. So, you know, I think that the government, you know, how I would characterize the immigration minister's response right now is a very desperate attempt to spin away from his responsibility to deliver a plan. And I mean, the statistics on Canadians, recent polling figures on Canadians' opinion on the capacity and the adequacy of the government's response or capability to do this shows that I don't think Canadians are buying it either.
Given your comments that the minister hasn't communicated on this issue very effectively, are you hopeful that, you know, how hopeful are you that this will actually be effective this time around?
Like, look, I want to be very clear on what our objective is here. I firmly believe, and I think my colleagues do as well, that we should have a compassionate asylum claim system. I want, like, when Bob Ray comes out and says we need to look at the Rohingya contingent, or if we go to, you know, my colleague Larry was with me in Uganda and we were looking at, you know, the victims of tribal warfare that were sitting in refugee camps, or, you know, when I communicate with the Yazidi community, Canada clearly has an obligation to help the world's most vulnerable. But what I worry about is that because the minister has refused to say, look, just very simply, we have a problem here. And here's, even if I disagree with his position, he needs to be clear on his position. First, like, is the United States a safe third country or not? And if he says that it isn't, I mean, that has some pretty big implications. But then how are you dealing with nearly 32,000 people who have come here in 18 months, right? So to me, I think when I watch the minister, he gets very frustrated when people question him on this. To me, this isn't a partisan issue. It's more about me and my colleagues here and our party leader, Andrew Scheer, putting pressure on the government to bring Canada's immigration system back to order so that that social license to continue high levels of immigration continues. That's something that we support, but it has to be done in a planned, orderly, and budgeted fashion. Otherwise, no one wins. People that are coming here their fate shouldn't be to be on buses to parts unknown. And also, Canadian taxpayers need to understand what the government's priorities are for humanitarian immigration and then eventual integration.
Vous avez parlé un peu plus tôt de l'incompétence de la gestion des libéraux dans ce dossier-là, en particulier celle de M. Hussein. Pensez-vous que M. Trudeau doit profiter du remaniement de mercredi pour le déposséder de son portfolio?
Je vais laisser au premier ministre choisir ses nouveaux ministres, mais écoutez, c'est clair que le ministre de l'Immigration n'a pas été en mesure de faire un travail qui est à la hauteur de ce qu'on attend d'un ministre du cabinet. Mais pour répondre à la question de M. de Radio-Canada, Je suis allé 2 fois à Roxham Road. On m'a accusé tantôt au comité d'avoir eu des propos en disant qu'on aurait 400 personnes par jour attendues. Mais là-bas, l'infrastructure qui est en place, le personnel qui est en place, est là pour accueillir 400 à 500 personnes par jour. On a même réservé l'hôtel qui est à côté des bâtiments. L'hôtel est vide et payé par le gouvernement du Canada, tout simplement pour attendre des gens. Donc, si les gens des services frontaliers ont prévu d'accueillir autant de personnes, c'est qu'il va y avoir des raisons et c'est pour ça qu'on veut avoir le plan et comprendre ce qui se passe.
I'll just make one more question or one more statement too. With, typically parliamentary procedure, committee procedure it's not sexy, but it was important today. It was very important towards the end to note that we had a committee chair try to ascribe motive to something that I had said in an effort to try and frame out how ministers should appear at the committee. It was very interesting to watch the debate on the wording of this motion. And to me, if all the committee members here have the intent on not using committee just as a talking point venue for the government, but actually to come up with a plan that hopefully will promote better relationships with the provinces and better outcomes for refugees and for Canadian taxpayers, then some of the things that happened with regard to procedure today were particularly important. So thank you to all of you for being here on a hot afternoon in the summer in July. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just as a point of clarification, so based on your comments, my understanding is that you have achieved consensus that the matter at hand in the letter that was expressed to you or sent to you would be accepted.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I want to lay out my rationale on why we're requesting this meeting and why I think it's really important for us to have a study prior to the House sitting in the fall, and why I think it's important for us to have the minister attend, and why it's important that we actually have 2 meetings so that we can have other witnesses. And my preference would be that we extend the opportunity to some of our provincial counterparts to get on the record some of their needs with the situation. So I'm going to try and do this in as non-partisan manner as possible, because I hope we can get consensus at the committee today. So I feel that Canada's immigration system should be planned, it should be orderly, and it should be compassionate. Mr. Chair, for clarification, you will entertain my notice of motion today, and you will find that in order. Great.
If you'd like to present it at the start,
sure.
That's very much in order. Okay,
thank you. So I will move the motion which I have given notice for, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration undertake a study to review the adequacy of the federal government's response to the impact of increased asylum seekers crossing into Canada from the United States, that the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship appear before the committee for the purposes of this study, and this study be comprised of at least 2 meetings, and this study be completed no later than August the 3rd, 2018. I am moving this motion today because evidence has mounted that Canada's immigration system has taken a marked departure from the principle of being run in a planned, orderly, and compassionate manner. And as parliamentarians, we have a responsibility to hold the government to account on this point for the sake of those seeking to come to Canada, newcomers to Canada, and for Canadian taxpayers. I ask for your support in this motion and will lay out my evidence for the statement I've just made, as well as the rationale as to why it's critical that we have these meetings as soon as possible. I think that regardless of our political affiliation, I would hope that we would agree that managing a compassionate humanitarian system means ensuring that Canada is prioritizing the world's most vulnerable in our resettlement efforts. I also hope that we would all agree that it means that those coming to Canada are encouraged to and supported into integrating into the social and economic fabric of our country. This means ensuring that newcomers learn one of Canada's official languages so that they do not experience long-term inclusion issues, that they are able to overcome any trauma they experienced in fleeing their home countries, and that they are able to acquire skills and find gainful employment and contribute as productive members of our community. In all of these points, as parliamentarians, we cannot allow long-term reliance on social supports to become the norm or an acceptable path for humanitarian immigrants. We can also not allow our humanitarian immigration system to become overburdened by those who will never have their asylum claims validated. If this happens, we will see an increased strain on Canada's social supports and decreased tolerance for immigration in Canada writ large. This is something that, again, regardless of political stripe, I would hope that none of us on this committee would desire to occur. In the context of a country with a generous social welfare system like Canada, it takes a high degree of planning and budgeting to make this happen. It takes data and constant monitoring of the processes related to the selection, screening, and then support of humanitarian immigrants. The instinct of some of you, especially those of you in the Liberal caucus, might be to become defensive and suggest that Canada isn't at risk of this happening. There's nothing wrong with Canada's system at present. But before you do, I would ask you to take a step back and reflect on some of the following data points. And I ask you to do so with open minds. And as parliamentarians that do not have government appointments and as such have a primary responsibility to hold the government to account for its decisions, regardless of political affiliation. I will start my argument by providing some important context on the capacity of our system to successfully respond to the issue that is occurring at Roxham Road. Since early 2016, Canada has resettled nearly 50,000 Syrian refugees. This was a massive initiative that was well above the usual year-over-year humanitarian immigration numbers that Canada plans for in its immigration levels plan. In testimony to our committee in 2016, many people from the Syrian refugee cohort and those related to the resettlement efforts stated that Syrian refugees came from primarily rural agrarian backgrounds, had literacy challenges in their first language, suffered trauma from war, did not have large amounts of formal education, and as such would face more integration challenges in the context of Canada's developed economy than previous cohorts of humanitarian immigrants. In short, this cohort of people had a lot of complex needs that required intense planning and budgeting in order to ensure that they successfully integrate into Canada. In 2016, this committee studied the needs of resettlement service providers following the Syrian initiative and heard from provincial and municipal leaders that the lack of additional resettlement services funding or any transfers to provincial health and education system made it difficult to adequately plan for or monitor the integration of the Syrian refugee cohort into Canadian society. Indeed, today, Federal Auditor General Michael Ferguson expressed his extreme concern in the government's failure to provide transparent progress reports on the integration of Syrian refugees into Canada. We have no data on how many are employed, how many have learned one of Canada's official language, or the cost of providing social welfare programs to these nearly 50,000 people. The last time the minister provided an update to this committee on this issue was well over a year ago, and at that time he stated 90% of the government-sponsored Syrian refugees were unemployed. Since then, the one-year funding provided by the federal government has expired, and based on this data that he provided, it is reasonable to suggest that many of the Syrian cohort will be drawing income from provincial social welfare programs. Further, many IRCC staff were at the time redirected to processing applications of Syrian refugees. This context is important to consider in relation to the motion at hand because prior to the influx of asylum seekers who had already reached the United States, Canada's system was struggling to adapt to the processing and integration needs of the Syrian cohort. You don't have to take my word for it. Many of you heard from resettlement services providers and from Syrian refugees themselves at this committee when we studied the issue in 2016. Then January 2017 happened. In January 2017, the Americans issued an executive order related to their immigration policy. In an unprompted response that has been since described as a holier-than-thou response by a National Post columnist, Canada's Prime Minister sent out a tweet that prompted tens of thousands of people to use a loophole in an agreement that we have with the United States that prevents asylum claim shopping to illegally cross the border from the United States into Canada and subsequently claim asylum. Again, you don't have to take my word on this. Media reports have shown the flurry of memos between embassies and the IRCC showing that this tweet was viewed as an open invitation to come to Canada. The number of people who have made this journey since January 2017 is 31,377. This is the highest level of unplanned immigration in recent Canadian history. And it is unplanned because it blows the government predictions for asylum seekers outlined in its immigration levels plan out of the water. In no scenario presented to Parliament or to this committee has the Minister or the Prime Minister laid out a scenario in which they have planned for tens of thousands of people to enter Canada via this method. Since then, as parliamentarians, we have no idea how much the government at the federal level has spent on tents, RCMP and CBSA overtime, transport, accommodation, new staffs, consultants, ministerial travel, and on related to the crisis at Roxham Road. We also have no idea how much the provincial governments have been required to spend on welfare, subsidized housing, emergency housing, food banks, education, daycare, healthcare, and other costs related to those crossing at Roxham Road. We also have no idea how much the government is planning on having to spend on the eventual removals of those found to have non-valid asylum claims. We know that the Immigration Refugee Board is at a crisis point, with internal memos suggesting that it will take years for someone who enters Roxham Road today to even have their refugee claim heard, which makes calculating the long-term impact on federal and provincial social programs budgets that's much more difficult. As parliamentarians, the government has provided us with no information on the expected needs of those crossing at Roxham Road. Do they speak one of Canada's official languages? Are they capable of working? Do they have skill sets that will meet the labour market demands of Canada's economy? And if so, will they settle in regions where those skills are needed? How is the government planning on ensuring that this will happen? Will this impact other immigration streams? We also have no information from the government on how many people they expect to illegally cross from Canada from the United States and subsequently claim asylum in the coming years and months. Rather, they have begun to use language that normalizes over 1,000 people entering Canada this way per month, which is an exceptionally large increase from recent history. For example, the minister recently tweeted out statistics that show an increase in June numbers year over year from 2017 to 2018 and suggested that this was a decrease in demand. At this point, it's becoming apparent to me that the government has done little analysis on the entire issue. This is even more concerning because the government has not expressed any desire to explore legislative options to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, but suggests that they are content to allow the demand on our system to begin a permanent phenomenon. And indeed, today, I would suggest that the government has made a policy decision to normalize this situation. I know that we all diverge on policy approaches with regard to the Safe Third Country Agreement, and I respect that. I will, however, say I find it unacceptable that we are allowing people who have already reached the United States of America, one of the most free democracies in the world, regardless of who occupies the White House, to claim asylum in Canada via a loophole in an agreement that, by the government's own admission, by the Prime Minister's own admission in the House of Commons, is still valid. I believe that by failing to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, the government has made a formal policy decision to normalize tens of thousands of people illegally crossing the border from the United States, and this has not been reflected in any immigration levels plan or formal budgetary process. Regardless of how you feel about this decision, on if it's right or not, it has been made, and Canadians now need information on how much this will cost them and how people will be integrated into Canada. This situation has been occurring for over a year and a half. It is irresponsible for us as parliamentarians to allow the government to piecemeal allocate hundreds of millions of dollars outside of the budgetary cycle when they've known for 18 months that this is an issue and didn't address it in a federal budget or estimates process. It is irresponsible for us to allow them to spend this money, piecemeal or not, without understanding the assumptions the government has based these decisions on, as I've outlined above. It is irresponsible for us to allow them to spend this money without discussing the opportunity cost of this decision. The federal government is already running billions of dollars in deficit, and this allocation of funds could be used to increase the processing efficacy of other immigration streams for those legally seeking to enter the country via the PSR stream, family reunification, and others. These funds could also be used to provide social supports for Canadians. Canadians need this information because if they don't have it, then they will lose faith in the ability of the government to run an immigration system that benefits the country and those who are most in need. They also need this information right now, before hundreds of people are turned out of homeless shelters on August the 9th, and before the House sits again in September. We're months away from the estimates process, and the government is making significant unbudgeted funding announcements without any of this information provided to Parliament, while they know that this has been an issue for over 18 months. I'd like to thank Mr. Maguire for requesting that the Parliamentary Budget Officer conduct a system-wide review of the federal government's expenditures on the Roxham Road crisis, and it's my understanding that the Parliamentary Budget Officer has agreed to this request. Given departments like the CBSA and IRCC have been late on or delinquent on questions raised by parliamentarians in committee in this regard, I would also like the opportunity to ask the Minister if he intends to direct his department to fully comply with the PBO's inquiry. We also need to learn how the government intends to prioritize those crossing at Roxham Road after already having reached the United States, in the context of ethnic cleansing happening to the Rohingya people, persecuted minorities languishing in UN refugee camps in the Middle East, and more. There are so many demands on us from agencies such as UNHCR to take more government-sponsored refugees, and now that the government has made a policy decision to normalize what is happening at Roxham Road and not close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement, we need to understand how this is going to affect other resettlement requests on our system. We also need to understand directly from the provinces what their needs are and what their expectations are for federal government support before we can assess whether or not the federal government's response is adequate. Based on what happened in Winnipeg on Friday, I don't think that the government's line that this is a team effort and we expect the provinces to just pick it up without understanding this data and seeing a long-term plan that's reflected in both the levels plan and our budgetary process is going to cut it any longer. In fact, I think it's irresponsible, both for people who are entering Canada and to Canadian taxpayers. According to a recent poll published in a Canadian newspaper, 70% of Canadians saying that they are saying that they don't feel that the federal government has an adequate plan to address this issue. We need these meetings now. We do not need them in September, and they need to have the minister here. Asking these questions of a government and ensuring that they have a plan that addresses all of these answered questions is the most Canadian thing that any of us sitting around this table could do. Look, Canada is unique in that all of our major political parties support immigration. We diverge on how that happens, but the reality is that in Canada in the last 18 months, we've seen a marked departure from normal immigration processes. And the government has made, by default or ignoring it or whatever, a significant policy change in refusing to look at legislative options to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. #Welcome to Canada has changed our humanitarian immigration system. And we do not have any of the data that I outlined here, and it is starting to bear very negative fruit. All of the concerns that I raised, we can differ on policy options, but the government needs to respond to these questions now. You know, the last few days, I've seen some really disappointing things come out of the Prime Minister's office, you know, calling an Ontario cabinet minister who's in charge of women's services alt-right because she's asking this question. Look, we can disagree on policy. We're not disagreeing on if immigration. We're just asking questions on how the government intends to do it. And it's not going to cut it for us to meet again at the end of September, because we know this minister is going to have to commit a significant amount of money to the provinces in order to just cover some of the concerns that are being raised by Mayor John Tory or Mayor Watson. As parliamentarians, we don't hold executive positions in government. Our job is to hold the government to account. And I know it might be difficult for Liberal colleagues to do that, but I ask that in order to get back to what we're supposed to be doing with the Immigration Committee, that we have the minister here and that we really subject him to some rigor on these questions. The government's response, even just in providing information, has been completely inadequate, and we also now need to hear from the provincial governments. Many of our provincial governments are in significant deficit situations. Many of our provincial governments are in positions where they have raised taxes, and I'm really worried about that 70% figure, because that 70% figure is something that could easily translate into a loss of social license in Canada for our humanitarian immigration system. And as somebody who has argued for the government to bring refugees to Canada, I don't want to see that happen. So I would hope that in the next week at a minimum, that we could have the minister here, that he would comport himself with dignity and with the respect of parliamentarians to answer some of these questions, and we would have an opportunity for our provincial counterparts to do the same. And then over the summer, over the fall session, we can start to hold the government to account for the need to have a more cohesive plan to address these issues. I don't find it fun to go out in front of a microphone in a scrum after the minister goes out every second week and is announcing $50 million here, $100 million here. I had to respond to the Liberals' plan, to the government's plan to put people, to quote-unquote triage people, put people who have crossed at Roxham Road and put them on a bus to Toronto. And then now that the homeless shelter capacity in Toronto is oversubscribed, to put them on a bus to parts unknown. These are people's lives. I mean, the reports that are coming out of the IRB about it taking years for claims to be processed, I mean, that's wrong because for so many reasons, because a quick and efficient IRB process, if the demand on the system was lower, I think would prevent some of this from happening. But the reality is the government has made a policy decision that is going to keep the demand on IRC really high for a long period of time. And we have to ask ourselves as parliamentarians, is appointing an entire and setting up an entire expanded bureaucracy for people, many of whom will not have valid asylum claims, the best use of taxpayer money? I might argue no, others might argue yes, but we need to have that discussion if the government is not going to close the loophole in the agreement, which is where we're at. I also think that that type of a system really is detrimental to people who have come to Canada, because they are, you know, how do you put down roots and get a job if it's going to take 7 years for you to have your asylum process claimed? Look, we've had the minister before committee before. I questioned him for 4 hours in the committee of the whole, and we still don't have a plan. The summer, we need to do this right now. We can't wait for 2.5 months. And, you know, through you, Mr. Chair, to all of my colleagues, regardless of political stripe, let's at least get the minister here, and let's at least have our provincial counterparts sit down so that we can start doing our job as parliamentarians and fixing the crisis situation that we're in right now. Thank you.